Okay, so today we're going to be talking about this idea of offense-defense theory. This is a way of thinking about the structure of the international system and how it can affect a whole bunch of things related to the likelihood of war, how cooperation works, the sort of level of threat perception, and we'll tie into a lot of what we'll talk about later with grand strategy. So just really briefly, what offense-defense theory is, it's the idea that at some points in time, the technology of warfare is going to give the advantage to the attacker or to the defender. And as technology changes, as tactics change, as new innovations emerge, that can balance. And when the attacker has the advantage, war is much more likely to occur because everybody sort of does the calculation and they realize that they're better off attacking quickly and first rather than waiting and trying to defend against a situation where the stronger party is this party that's marching forward. When defense is dominant, when defense has the advantage, war is going to be less common. There's not going to be a sense of like, if I don't strike first, I'm going to be overwhelmed. Parties are willing to sit back and wait and allow time for diplomacy to resolve things because nobody wants to be on the front lines attacking someone else. And so we could look at different examples of how technology has changed over time. For a good chunk of human history, nomads had sort of an inherent offensive capability and were incredibly effective. They could move quickly across territory. They could sweep into an area and reap devastating effects on more sedentary peoples. Sedentary peoples responded by building up fortifications, and it turns out fortifications, castle walls, are really effective at stopping nomads. They arrive, they can't get in. They're probably didn't bring along siege equipment. They hang out for a while, they deplete the grass, and they move on. So that technology shifted the balance from people who have access to horses are going to be militarily effective to people who have access to fortifications are going to be militarily effective. Similarly, we saw a shift back to a more offense-dominant system. In the 1450s, when the Ottoman Turks show up at the gates of Constantinople, and they bring with them cannon, heavier cannon than had been used before in warfare, and within essentially a morning, they're able to punch through the walls of Constantinople and invade. And suddenly, castle walls, this defensive technology, no longer can confer sort of overwhelming military superiority. Suddenly, having access to cannon and being able to use those cannon effectively gives you a tremendous offensive advantage. So we can see that technology changes sort of the logic of warfare. Offense-defense theory has had a long history. Lots of people have been sort of been working on this for a very long time. And so we've got a bunch of different things that we think affect the offense-defense balance, and we have a bunch of different things that we think are probably related to it. And so technology is what I've been emphasizing so far, right? The shift from, nomadic movement to sedentary castles, the shift from castles to cannon, all of that's technology related. But geography also plays a role, and we'll talk quite a bit about that today. You could argue that maybe force size and the ability to marshal forces might play a role, or patterns of diplomatic behavior, the ability to identify an attacker or any number of sort of rules of war might change some of this as well. In terms of the consequences, we could look at war causation, right? How likely people are to start a war or to avoid war, arms race dynamics, who forms alliances with whom, how we respond in crisis situations, whether it's easy to negotiate and resolve those crises or there's a rush to war. It can affect the system structure and the stability of a multipolar or a bipolar system, and then relative gain sensitivity, right? The idea that over time, some parties might gain some strength and others might not. And if somebody's pulling ahead of you and gaining power, if you're in an offensive situation, that might be really terrifying because if somebody starts pulling away and gaining power, that could translate very quickly into war. If you're in a defense dominant situation, if somebody gains in power, you can still look at that and say, war and attacking me is still a bad idea. The fact that you're a little bit stronger than me now doesn't change that basic calculation. Nobody likes to attack a castle with ladders and horses. Okay, so building on this idea that the offense-defense balance has a lot going into it, and it might actually be really complex, Robert Jervis, in his article, Cooperation Under Anarchy, differentiates 4 different kinds of scenarios that he thinks shape sort of what cooperation looks like in the international system. And so he looks at two different dimensions, right? One is what we've talked about so far. Is offense the better way to go in conflict, or is defense the better way to go in conflict? Which is dominant, offense or defense? But then also, can you identify if somebody is developing offensive military capabilities or defensive military capabilities? Can you pick that out or not? And so to give you sort of an example of this, if somebody's building a castle, I can be reasonably confident that that castle is a defensive technology, that nobody builds a castle with which to attack. Castles don't move. That's the very nature of a castle. On the other hand, if somebody's building a tank, I don't know if they're building that tank to support infantry to prepare for an invasion of their country, a defensive tank, or if they're building that tank to drive across their border and into a neighbor's territory, an offensive tank. It's very hard to know what the purpose of that military machine is when it can be used in both ways. And lots of technology has this sort of dual use offense, defense, or not dual use offense, defense. And so I'll give you another example. Long-range bombers are offensive technology. There's no reason to develop a long-range bomber other than to fly to someone else's territory and blow stuff up. By contrast, short-range fighters are defensive technology. The reason why you build short-range fighters is to shoot down long-range bombers that are incoming into your territory, right? Although, if you take a short-range fighter and put it on an aircraft carrier and then float it across oceans, that short-range fighter becomes a way to attack the air force of another country. And so now it's offensive again. But at any rate, you can sort of get the sense that we can think about the technologies, what are its capabilities, and how is it likely to be used in a military situation. And so what Jervis identifies is that when offense has the advantage and you can't tell if a technology is offensive or defensive, that's a really bad situation. Because what that means is that the attacker's likely to win, and you can't tell if your neighbor is plotting to attack you. By contrast, if we're in an offensive dominant situation, but I can tell the difference between an offensive technology and a defensive technology, a long-range bomber versus a short-range fighter, then I can look at what my neighbors are doing. I can recognize that they pose a real threat to me. If they attack me, I will take it on the chin, but I will also be able to watch what they're doing and get a sense of if that's their actual intention. And if my neighbor is only building short-range fighters and no long-range bombers, okay, they could hurt me, but that doesn't seem to be what they're building their military up to do. So I can identify aggressors, and I can, in theory, respond and counter that. When there's a defensive advantage to warfare, and you can't tell if somebody's building offensive or defensive equipment, okay, you don't necessarily have to have a sort of heightened sense of alarm. Attacking you would be a bad idea, but you also can't tell whether the person on your border wishes you well or wants to invade you. That's not something you can determine, but you can determine that if we can identify differences in the kinds of technology. That's what Jervis describes as a doubly stable situation. So this is really important, but then we can sort of turn this around and recognize that while the role of technology and geography and tactics and all this stuff contribute to the offense-defense balance, probably more important than what's actually going on the ground is the perception that people have about whether or not the system is offense dominant or defense dominant. And so the classic example is in the lead up to World War I, where all the parties involved in World War I were under the impression that the party that attacked first would be able to decisively win quickly and easily, and and would roll through successfully. The assumption was that offense was dominant and overwhelmingly dominant, to the point where you have military planners in Germany saying we need to strike first, in France saying we need to strike first, and even folks in Belgium arguing that Belgium should strike first against much stronger, more powerful neighbors because of the power of offense dominance, except that that wasn't the world that they were living in. Trench warfare very quickly cements the lines in World War I, and it turns into a long, grueling conflict in which taking territory is incredibly painful and incredibly brutal, and it's just a miserable situation. And so parties can completely misread where they're at, and their behavior can be disastrous as a result. Okay, I want to pivot into talking about geography and how geography affects the offense-defense balance and that idea of threat perception. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. It doesn't necessarily generalize well. I can't say, well, this is sort of how geography affects things. But for each country, you can sort of think about the geography that they have, the situation that they're in, and how that might affect their sense of threat, of concern about being attacked, or their ability to attack others. And so I think probably the easiest one to start with is this idea of strategic depth, right, which is the ability to withstand an initial wave of invasion. And this ends up being really important in South Asia. And I don't think you can actually understand what's happening in South Asia without understanding this idea of strategic depth. And if you think about sort of India and Pakistan, these two sort of long-running rivals, India is sort of a diamond-shaped country, right? It's this big sort of square turned on its side. Pakistan is this sort of narrow little rectangle that's sort of on one side of India. It actually used to be Pakistan and Bangladesh as a single country, where you have that sort of narrow rectangle on the northwestern side of India, and on the eastern side of India there was this sort of small box of Bangladesh that was completely surrounded by India. And so Pakistan was further cut in half by India. But what this produces in Pakistan is a realization that if Pakistan tries to invade India, they'll make it a couple hundred miles in, and India will be able to counter. And they have essentially zero chance of overrunning the Indian territory. By contrast, if India launches an invasion of Pakistan, Pakistan's fairly narrow. And it's possible that India could overrun Pakistan in an initial surprise military invasion, and that would be devastating. And so Pakistan, sort of responding to the sense of we are vulnerable to invasion, have sought strategic depth, an ability to pull back and retreat, to have a landing area or a staging area where a counteroffensive can be mobilized, the way that India would have in sort of the south of the country if Pakistan were to invade it. And given the situation, Pakistan has looked around for strategic depth and identified Afghanistan. And so since the 1970s, it has been a core strategic goal of Pakistan to make sure that there's a friendly government in Afghanistan that they have influence over, that they can fall back to should India invade them, and that can be used as a staging area for a reconquest of Pakistan. So strategic depth ends up being a really core driver of Pakistan's foreign policy, because there's a sense that they are vulnerable, and the way to counter that is through being involved in Afghanistan. We can also look at the shape of the border, and there's a couple different ways to think about this. One is to think about it as sort of like a concave border, where you're sort of on the side where you can move in any different direction and strike at an adversary. And so if I was thinking about India and Pakistan still before Bangladesh breaks off, India has sort of the advantage of a concave border. It can park itself in northern India, and it can strike into West Pakistan, or it can strike into East Pakistan. And if Pakistan wants to try to prepare for either of those contingencies, it's going to have to send troops up around through the Soviet Union to reach East Pakistan, or it's going to have to sail them south around India and back up the other side to reach East Pakistan. And so it's much more difficult to move soldiers and equipment to the front where they might be needed than when you have the advantage of a concave border. So we could also see this in the American Civil War, where the North sort of had this convex border, and the South had a concave border, which allowed for forces stationed in the South to strike into the West or to strike north. And in order to counter that, the United States had to have forces dispersed in a much wider area to try to counter the South, right? So the shape of the border can matter. The shape of the border can also, or the shape of the territory, I should say, can also affect invasion. And so I may point to Russia, which has sort of historically been impossible to invade, whether you're Napoleon or the Soviet Union. If you're coming from the West, you start out really good, in part because the shape of the territory for Russia starts out fairly narrow, where it meets with Europe. But as you move eastward across Russian territory, the border sort of spreads out, and you find yourself, or not the border, the front line that you're going to have to defend spreads out, and it takes more and more forces the further you go to try to hold and secure that front. And so typically what happens with an invasion of Russia is initially there's an invasion, forces spread out trying to hold this long front, and then Russia counterattacks and is able to punch through that. By contrast, Mexico has sort of the reverse situation if they're thinking about invasion from the United States, where the border or the front would initially be very long, but if the United States were to move south, as it would move south, that front line would get smaller and smaller and smaller. So geography shapes a lot of how countries think about invasion, about how they think about their security relative to their neighbors. There's not a systematic story to tell, but each country faces sort of a unique situation that's worth thinking about. Okay, we could also talk about the physical geography, like the mountains and the rivers and the canyons. Just as sort of a general rule, rough terrain makes force difficult to project. It's hard to move armies across mountains. It's really challenging. It's hard to control mountainous territory. Just as a general rule. And we actually see that in studies of civil war, which have found that the more mountainous a country's territory is, the more likely it is to suffer a civil war, in part because it's really hard for governments to project force into mountains, and it's very easy for insurgents to sort of fall back and use mountains as a base and as a foundation for building up a resistance. Also, the geography is going to affect what kind of military technology is functional. And so in Vietnam, the United States had lots of tanks, but it wasn't able to use them as a part of how it fought the Vietnam War, because Vietnam is largely a jungle environment. The United States had to then respond by using planes to fly over the jungle and defoliate, kill the plant life in the jungle as an effort to make it easier to operate within that terrain. In the Iraq war in 1991, when Iraq had invaded Kuwait, the United States was really concerned about whether or not it would be able to operate its tanks effectively in Iraq. There's concern about the gears and whether or not sand getting into the gears would limit the mobility of tanks. Once they worked out that problem, Iraq turned into sort of an ideal situation for tank warfare and an ideal environment for U.S. tank warfare, where U.S. tanks were able to roll at very high speeds across the desert. And so you get this almost classic maneuver kind of tank warfare because of the nature of the terrain. Weather contributes to that as well, right? The seasons, and whether it's the rainy season or the winter season where passes might be closed, all of that plays a role. Political geography plays a role. If you're looking to invade a country that's landlocked, you need to work with the neighbors. And so the U.S. has, for almost 2 decades now, struggled to manage the politics of operating in Afghanistan. That you need access to air bases in the region, you need access to land-based supply lines to be able to support a large number of troops in Afghanistan. And in order to do that, you need to maintain a partnership with the neighboring countries that will allow you to have that kind of access. So political geography feeds into this as well. And the last piece I want to sort of put on everybody's radar is this idea of the stopping power of water. And this is an observation that's made by John Mearsheimer, who notes that fundamentally different types of militaries are needed to project force across land and across water. Right? And this, once you sort of think about this idea, it becomes obvious, but it's incredibly profound, right? That the most powerful land army on the planet can be marching quite effectively and rolling across territory, but once it hits an ocean, it has to stop. And unless there is a navy waiting to ferry that army across to the next chunk of land, that army essentially becomes useless because of the nature of geography. And so you need to retool or secure access to a navy. What that means is that if you are a land power, that you are surrounded by countries, and you think about your military security in terms of armies marching across your border, you're going to develop land power. Develop your own army, you're going to develop your own tanks, you're going to try to prepare for that land-based invasion. If you're an island power, whether you're like literally an island like Great Britain, or whether you're an island power like the United States, where the US does not fear a land-based invasion from Canada or a land-based invasion from Mexico, you're likely to develop a navy. Because if you imagine what it would look like to have a country attack you and invade you, that sort of scenario almost always involves a country using a navy to bring forces to your shores. And the most effective way to stop that is to intercept that army at sea before it can reach your territory. And so given whether or not you face a peer competitor who's geographically contiguous, like Germany and France, for throughout much of the 18th and 19th centuries, were sort of worried about each other, or whether you think about your security in terms of securing your coastlines against a foreign fleet landing. You're going to develop fundamentally different types of navies and armies and military equipment, all that's going to then affect the nature of how you project force out into the world. And navies are incredibly effective at projecting force outward into the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about the sort of the consequences of that and sort of the logic of that when we talk about military doctrine.